Everyone in the quiet town of Willow Creek knew Margaret Bell as the gentle old lady with silver hair and soft eyes that carried 1,000 memories. For 40 years, she lived in the same modest two-story house on Maple Street, the one with the peeling blue shutters and the rose bushes she trimmed every Sunday. Most people didn't know her past, just that she used to be a school teacher and that she was a widow. But they all knew one thing. Margaret had a kind heart. Maybe too kind. 12 years ago, when she was 65, Margaret did something most people wouldn't dare. She adopted a grown man. His name was Caleb, and he was 25 at the time. He had bounced around foster homes, juvenile centers, and halfway houses. When she met him through a local outreach program at her church, he was working at a gas station and living in his car. Something about him, his brokenness maybe, or the loneliness in his eyes, tugged at her. She opened her home and eventually her heart. She gave him everything: a clean room, hot meals, encouragement. He got back on his feet. She helped him get into community college, even sold her wedding ring to pay his tuition. People whispered, "Why would an old woman take in a grown man like that?" Some thought she was being scammed, but Margaret believed love could fix anything. Years passed. Caleb started calling her Mom. On holidays, they posed for photos together. He moved from part-time jobs to a full-time position in real estate. He even helped her get the house renovated, saying he wanted her to live in comfort. She felt blessed. She told everyone, "He saved me from loneliness. I gave him a home and he gave me a reason to live." But slowly, things changed. Caleb stopped spending evenings at home. He was always working late. Margaret noticed a shift in his tone. He stopped calling her Mom and started saying Margaret. Small things at first, but they cut deep. Then came the arguments, the money talks, the passive-aggressive comments about her age, the complaints about the cost of her medications, her doctor visits, the burden of keeping the house in her name. She thought it was stress, work, pressure. She made excuses for him, until one rainy evening, when everything fell apart. He came home drunk, not tipsy, slurring, stumbling, angry. He stood in the living room, dripping water on her favorite rug, and said something she'd never forget. "You're just an old woman taking up space. This house should be mine." Margaret froze. Her hands trembled as she clutched her robe tighter. "Caleb, what are you talking about?" He tossed a folded document on the table. It was a power of attorney form. "Sign it. Transfer the house to me. You don't need all this. I've earned it." She stared at him like she didn't know him anymore, because maybe she didn't. When she refused, he didn't yell. He didn't hit her. He did something worse. He walked to the front door, opened it wide, and said, "Then get out." At 77 years old, in the middle of a storm, Margaret Bell was kicked out of the house she had lived in for 4 decades by the very man she once called son. She left with nothing but a small suitcase and a photo of her late husband. People in the neighborhood were stunned but said nothing. No one wanted to get involved. She ended up at a women's shelter 2 towns over, too ashamed to tell anyone who she was or what happened. Days blurred, nights were colder, her arthritis flared, yet she said nothing. Not even when the staff asked if she had family. Then, one Tuesday morning, sitting on a worn-out couch in the shelter lobby, she scratched a $5 lottery ticket someone had given her as a charity gift. She stared at the numbers, then at the ticket. And then she laughed, a sharp, tearful, breathless laugh that startled everyone around her. Because right there, under the silver dust and faded ink, it read, "Jackpot winner, $440,000. Margaret couldn't move. The old ticket trembled in her wrinkled hands. For a few long seconds, she thought it was a cruel joke. Maybe her eyesight was playing tricks or her tired brain had misread it. But when the shelter worker, a young girl named Lila, saw her expression and came over, everything changed. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Lila asked gently. Margaret didn't answer. She simply held out the ticket. Lila looked down at it, squinted, and gasped. Wait, is this real? You scratched this just now?" Margaret nodded slowly, still in shock. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I think so." Within minutes, the room was buzzing. Lila was on the phone with the lottery office, double-checking the numbers. 2 staff members gathered around. "Tell a ticket like it was holy." Margaret sat still, hands folded on her lap, almost in a daze. Part of her thought someone would come running in and say there had been a mistake. But there was no mistake. She was the sole winner of the $440 million state lottery. By noon, a black car was sent to pick her up, escorted by lottery officials. The shelter staff waved her off like a celebrity. Some cried. Others just smiled in disbelief. Margaret promised she'd never forget their kindness. Inside the car, she stared out the window, her mind racing. She thought of her husband, Harold, of their long walks, of their tiny garden, of the house they built together, one paycheck at a time. And she thought of Caleb, the boy she loved like blood, the man who betrayed her without a second thought. She hadn't even cried when he kicked her out. Not until now. Now, tears spilled quietly down her cheeks, not from sadness, but something more bitter, a deep ache mixed with a strange sense of power. This money didn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it gave her something she hadn't had in months: control. By evening, Margaret had a check in her hand, a lawyer by her side, and 5 security officers watching her every step. She declined. All interviews. Not yet, she told the press. Let them guess. The first thing she did wasn't buy a mansion or book a cruise. No, the first thing she did was purchase a small, cozy apartment under a fake name while her lawyer handled the money privately through a trust. The second thing she did? She began watching Caleb. She hired a private investigator, a calm, stone-faced man named Roger. He didn't ask too many questions, just nodded and said, "Tell me what you want to know." "I want to know everything," she said. "Where he lives, what he does, who he's with, how he sleeps at night." It took 2 weeks. Margaret spent the days drinking tea, listening to old jazz and reading about estate law. But every evening, Roger would come by and give her updates. Caleb had moved fast after kicking her out. He had sold the house, pocketed over $300,000. He now lived in a sleek high-rise condo in the city, drove a leased Mercedes, and was dating a woman 10 years younger who had no idea how he'd gotten his family inheritance. He'd told everyone that his mother died peacefully in her sleep. Margaret didn't flinch when she heard that, but she made a note. She wasn't angry in the way people expected. No screaming, no shouting. Her revenge wouldn't be a loud storm. It would be quiet, calculated, absolute. And it started with a visit to her new lawyer. "I want to buy back my house," she said. "Every inch of it, and I don't care what it costs." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "It's been flipped. Market price is nearly double now. Are you sure?" She smiled for the first time in days. A cold, slow smile. "I'm not asking," she said. "I'm telling you. Make it happen." And just like that, Margaret Bell, the woman who once had nowhere to go, began laying the bricks of her comeback, one silent move at a time. Margaret had always been the kind of woman who forgave too easily. She had let things slide, hurtful comments, cold shoulders, even betrayal. But this time was different. Something in her had changed the moment she saw that lottery ticket. Not just her luck, but her spine. She didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. She wanted something deeper. She wanted truth. And a little justice wouldn't hurt either. Within the week, her lawyer, Mr. Dalton, returned with good news. The house on Maple Street had been bought by a property flipper right after Caleb sold it. It had gone through quick renovations and was now sitting empty, staged for resale. The new owner had no idea who Margaret Bell was, just that some lady was offering cash, well above asking price. "Done," Dalton said. "It's yours again." Margaret signed the papers with a yamba, steady hand, no hesitation. The house she was kicked out of now belonged to her once more. But she had no plans of moving back into it. Not yet. Instead, she began fixing it up. Not like before, with Caleb's cheap shortcuts and modern grey paint slapped over history. This time, she hired professionals to restore every inch. Hardwood floors were polished. The original shutters were repainted the same soft blue Harold once loved. She even had the rose bushes replanted exactly as they were. And then, she did something no one expected. She turned it into a grief recovery center for elderly women, those abandoned by families, mistreated by caregivers, or simply forgotten by the world. She named it Harold's Rest, in honor of the only man who had ever truly loved her. Word spread quickly. The small town that had turned its back on her began whispering again, only this time it was different. "Did you hear about Margaret Bell? She bought the house back. They say she won the lottery." "No, can't be. Can't be. She's building something beautiful for people like her." Meanwhile, Caleb had no idea. He was too busy basking in his fake success, hosting cocktail parties in his condo, showing off watches he couldn't pronounce, and talking about building generational wealth to anyone who'd listen. His girlfriend, a glamorous woman named Brielle, was already posting couple photos with captions like "power duo," but trouble was on the horizon. One afternoon, Caleb received a strange letter. No return address, just his name in bold print. Inside it read, "Do you ever think about the woman who gave you everything? Because she hasn't forgotten you." He crumpled the letter and laughed it off. "Weird," he told Brielle. "Probably just some church freak." But something about it lingered in his mind. He started dreaming of Margaret, of her disappointed eyes, her soft voice when she begged him not to throw her out. The guilt was there, buried under his ego, trying to claw its way up. It didn't help that real estate deals were drying up. His hot streak was mostly smoke and mirrors. The money from selling the house was nearly gone. He'd overextended, on credit, trying to live like a man 10 tax brackets above his means. 1 week later, another letter arrived. "You sold a house that didn't belong to you. Now watch what I build with what does." This time he didn't laugh. He Googled the address. Maple Street. And there it was. A bright new sign on the front lawn, captured by a local newspaper photo. Harold's Rest, a safe haven for forgotten women, founded by Margaret Bell. His stomach dropped. "No way," he muttered. Brielle leaned over his shoulder. "Wait, Margaret Bell, that your mum?" "She's not my mum," he snapped, louder than intended. He slammed. The laptop shut. Everything he thought was buried was coming back. And this time it had teeth. Margaret wasn't done. She was just getting started. The next few days felt like a pressure cooker for Caleb. He couldn't focus at work. His hands trembled every time he checked the mail. He started seeing Margaret's face in strangers at the grocery store, hearing her voice in dreams in quiet rooms in the gaps between thoughts. Guilt was a powerful thing. It didn't scream. It whispered. And it was whispering now, louder than ever. Brielle noticed. "You've been off lately," she said one night over dinner. "Is something going on with that woman, Margaret?" He shot her a sharp look. "She's not a threat, just a bitter old woman trying to stir the pot." Brielle raised an eyebrow. "You told me she passed away." "I thought she did," he lied quickly. "We lost contact years ago." She didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes, and that terrified him more than anything. Not because he cared about her, but because Brielle had money, and if she left, he'd be exposed. He wasn't a self-made real estate mogul. He was a broke con man who had tricked a lonely old woman and burned through her generosity. The walls were closing in. Across town, Margaret sat on a bench outside Harold's Rest, sipping peppermint tea, watching elderly women in sun hats tend to the new garden. Her heart was still heavy, but the bitterness was softening, replaced with something firmer, purpose. One of the residents, a frail woman named Doris, shuffled up beside her. "You're the one who started all this, right?" Doris asked. Margaret smiled. "I guess I am." Doris looked around, then said softly, "You saved my life, you know. My son, he locked me in a trailer for months, took my pension, told everyone I had dementia." Margaret's heart clenched. She reached out and held Doris's hand. "You're safe now," she said. That night, Margaret lay in bed and stared at the ceiling fan, thinking of Caleb, not just of the betrayal, but of who he had become. She had raised him like a son, but somewhere along the way, his hunger for power devoured everything human in him. But she knew something about Caleb he hadn't figured out yet. He had built his life on a lie. She made one more phone call to her lawyer. "I want you to file a claim on the house sale," she said. "When he sold it, it was still legally mine. I never signed it over." Mr. Dalton paused. That could get ugly. "Good," she said. "Let it." Days later, Caleb got served. Official legal notice, fraudulent sale of property, Margaret Bell vs. Caleb Graham. He laughed when he saw it. Too hard, too fake. "She's insane," he barked. "This won't go anywhere." But inside, he was sweating. Because he knew, deep down, he knew. He had forged her signature on the property transfer papers. And now, with all her new money, she had the power to drag him into court and bury him. He called her that night. It was the first time in over a year. She didn't answer. So he left a voicemail. His voice shook. "Margaret, look, I'm sorry. Okay, I messed up. I wasn't thinking. Maybe we can talk this out. You don't need to ruin my life. I'm still your son." But he wasn't. Not anymore. Margaret listened to the voicemail once, deleted it and went back to reading. The next day, the media got wind of the lawsuit. Lottery winner Sue's adopted son, who kicked her out, calls it elder fraud. The story spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Caleb wasn't a hotshot. He was a headline. And not the kind that got you clients. His phone stopped ringing. His inbox dried up. Brielle packed her bags without a word. By the end of the week, Caleb Graham was officially under investigation for elder abuse and property fraud. And Margaret? She stood outside Harold's Rest, with the press around her, calm and composed, answering questions with a quiet strength. One reporter asked, "If you could say one thing to Caleb right now, what would it be?" She didn't hesitate. "I hope you learn how it feels to be thrown away, because money comes and goes, but kindness, that's what makes you rich." Then she walked back inside, surrounded by women who knew her pain and were finally free of it. The lawsuit progressed faster than anyone expected. Margaret's legal team wasted no time unearthing everything: documents, voice recordings, transaction records, even testimonies from neighbors who'd witnessed her being pushed out of the house. The forged signature was the final nail in Caleb's coffin. The handwriting expert made it undeniable. In court, Caleb looked nothing like the sharp, smug man from before. His once pristine suits hung loose on his frame, and the confidence he wore like armor had crumbled. He tried to play the victim at first, telling the judge he was misguided, that he thought Margaret had given him the house as a gift. But when Margaret took the stand, the room fell silent. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She simply told the truth. "I loved him like my own blood. I gave him everything I had. And when I was no longer useful, he discarded me like trash. He took my home, my dignity, and nearly my will to live. I don't want revenge, Your Honor. I want justice. And I want the system to show people like him, who prey on the vulnerable, that there are consequences." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even the judge's eyes softened for a moment before returning to the papers on his bench. 2 weeks later, the verdict came in. Guilty. Caleb was ordered to pay damages, legal fees, and, most significantly, face possible jail time for fraud and elder abuse. But that wasn't what broke him. It was the reputation. The name he had worked so hard to build now smeared across every news outlet in the country. Adopted son scams elderly woman, then gets sued by her after she wins $440 million. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. Friends vanished. Employers cut ties. The condo lease was terminated. He tried applying for jobs at fast food joints, but even there managers didn't want the PR risk. Margaret, meanwhile, continued to thrive, but quietly. She never flaunted her wealth. Instead, she used it to open 2 more facilities like Harold's Rest, one in a neighboring city and another in her home state of Georgia. Her mission was simple: help elderly women who had been used, discarded, or forgotten, just like she had been. Every ribbon-cutting ceremony brought in waves of media attention. Not because she wanted fame, but because her story struck a nerve in society. People began talking about elder abuse more openly, about the exploitation of kindness, about how family isn't always defined by blood. And with every article, every headline, Caleb was reminded that he could have been a hero in her story, but he chose to be the villain. One gray morning, nearly a year after the verdict, Caleb sat alone on a park bench eating a stale sandwich. His phone buzzed, an unknown number. Out of instinct, he answered. "Hello?" A pause, then a familiar voice. "Did you learn anything?" His chest tightened. "Margaret?" "Yes," she said, calm, still. "I just wanted to hear it from you." He swallowed hard. I did." I was wrong. I know that now." "Too late," she said softly, "but I hope for your sake you change." She didn't wait for a reply. The line went dead. And for the first time in months, Caleb didn't feel angry or ashamed or bitter. He felt empty. Back at Harold's Rest, Margaret hung up the phone and looked out the window, sipping her tea. Outside, Doris and a few other ladies were laughing as they painted birdhouses in the sun. She smiled faintly, because no matter what Caleb had taken, she had built something stronger in return. He had thrown her out, thinking she had nothing left, but Margaret Bell had something no one saw coming, a second chance. And this time, she wasn't giving it away. As summer deepened, so did Margaret's peace. The morning light spilled gently across the polished floors of Harold's Rest, warming the air with a calm that had taken years and $440 million to rebuild. But it wasn't the money that healed her. It was the freedom, the ability to wake up every morning without fear, to walk through a place she'd built with love, surrounded by women who understood pain and survival, women like her. The three homes, Willow Creek, Atlanta, and Greenville, were now officially part of the Margaret Bell Foundation, and each month, new women were rescued from dark corners of the world. Their stories were all different, but the endings, those were changing. One morning, Lila, the shelter worker who had first noticed the lottery ticket, visited Harold's Rest with her fiancé. Margaret hadn't seen her since that fateful day. "So you don't even look like the same woman," Lila said with a smile. Margaret laughed gently. "I don't feel like her either." They talked in the garden, and for the first time, Margaret shared everything, the full story. From adopting Caleb to the betrayal, the stormy night she was kicked out, to sitting in that shelter lobby scratching the ticket that would change her life. "I think God was watching," Lila said. Margaret smiled, but her eyes were tired. Maybe. Or maybe life just wanted to remind me that kindness, even when abused, still has power. As they walked back toward the house, Lila paused. "Have you heard about Caleb lately?" Margaret didn't turn around. "No, and I don't need to," but she had. Quietly, through her lawyer and a few discreet sources, she kept tabs, not out of spite but caution. She knew people like Caleb. They didn't go down quietly. He was now living in a rundown apartment in a low-income neighborhood, working part-time delivering groceries. His license to work in real estate had been revoked. He was a ghost of the man he once tried to be. He'd applied for bankruptcy, twice, and failed both times. And then came the letter. Unlike the others, this one wasn't anonymous. It was handwritten, shaky, addressed to Mrs. Margaret Bell. "I know I have no right to ask for your time. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I'm sick. I don't have long. Liver disease. No insurance. I'm not asking for money. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. You were the only real family I ever had. I threw it away, and now I sit in this dark little room every night wondering how I became this person. I hope you found happiness. I hope you're surrounded by love. I hope someone brings you tea without asking like you used to do for me. That's all. Caleb." Margaret sat with the letter for hours. She didn't cry. She didn't burn. She just folded it and placed it in a small wooden box with other pieces of her past. That night, she lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling fan once more. Caleb was dying. She had every reason to ignore him, every right. But she also knew what it felt like to be alone, sick, and unwanted. And she wasn't like him, not in heart. So the next morning, she made a call. "Find out what hospital he's in," she told Mr. Dalton. By that afternoon, she walked through the fluorescent-lit halls of a city hospital. No cameras, no security, just her in a modest cardigan and worn loafers. She found his room, 317C. He was thinner, pale. The sharp edges of his face had dulled, his eyes sunken with pain and years of bitterness. He looked up slowly, and when he saw her, his face crumpled. "I didn't think you'd come," he whispered. She stepped forward, not smiling, not frowning, just present. "I didn't come for closure," she said. "I came because someone should." He started to cry then. Not dramatic sobs, just silent, broken weeping, the kind that comes when there's no one left to lie to. "I ruined everything," he choked out. "I killed the only good thing in my life." Margaret sat down. "Yes, you did." He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. "I don't want your forgiveness," he whispered. "But can you just sit here for a while?" And she did. For the next hour, Margaret sat in silence beside the man who once betrayed her. Not because he deserved it, but because she did. She deserved to know she had survived him, and that he would leave this world knowing he didn't destroy her. Caleb passed away 3 days later. There was no funeral, no visitors, no next of kin, just a silent departure in a quiet hospital room. The nurses said he went peacefully, as if he was ready, like a man who had finally stopped running from his guilt. Margaret arranged for a basic cremation. Nothing elaborate, no memorial, no eulogy. But she did make sure he wasn't dumped in a county morgue, forgotten like the life he had tried to steal from her. When the ashes were delivered to her lawyer's office, she simply said, "Spread them somewhere quiet, somewhere he can rest." And then she let him go. For real this time. Back at Harold's Rest, life carried on. The laughter of elderly women filled the halls, birds chirped in the garden, and the soft smell of fresh bread lingered in the air. New residents came in weekly, each with their own tragedies and trauma. And Margaret welcomed them all, not with pity, but with dignity. She'd become something of a legend by now. The story of the woman who was kicked out, then became a millionaire, had taken on a life of its own. They called her Mother Margaret in some circles. Others, more cynically, labeled her the lucky widow. But those who knew her best saw something deeper. She wasn't a victim anymore, she was a builder. One afternoon, as she walked the hallway of the Willow Creek home, she passed a group of new arrivals. One woman, frail and hollow-eyed, looked up and asked, "Are you the one who lost everything?" Margaret paused, then smiled softly. "Yes, and I gained more than I ever thought possible." That night, she opened a small journal she'd been keeping since the day she scratched the winning ticket. It was leather-bound, aged now with scribbled notes and half-finished thoughts. But tonight, she didn't write about Caleb, or the house, or the lawsuit. She wrote about silence. Silence can be cruel, the silence of being ignored, forgotten, left behind. But there's another kind too. The silence of healing, of peace, the quiet after the storm that says, "You survived." She closed the book and walked to the window. Across the courtyard, 2 women were sitting under the rose bushes, knitting quietly. A soft breeze moved through the leaves, and the sunlight made everything look golden. Almost sacred. Then came a knock on her door. It was Lila again, this time holding a small envelope. "Mail just came in. Looks like a formal offer from Netflix." Margaret blinked. "Netflix?" Lila laughed. "They want to buy the rights to your story. A film, apparently, based on your life." Margaret let out a long sigh, amused and tired at the same time. "They think it's a movie." "Isn't it?" "No," she said gently. "It's a warning. That kindness without boundaries can become a trap, and that no one, no matter how broken, deserves to be made a footnote in someone else's life." Still, she accepted the envelope and placed it on the side table. She wasn't interested in money anymore, but maybe, just maybe, the world needed to hear her story from her mouth, not filtered through headlines and Hollywood scripts. Later that evening, she gathered the residents for tea. The sun dipped low over Willow Creek, casting warm shadows across the porch. The women sat together, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, all of them sipping tea like royalty. Margaret stood in front of them, a small cup in hand. "I've been asked to tell my story again," she began, "and maybe I will, but only if it includes your stories too. Because I wasn't the only one thrown away. I wasn't the only one betrayed by someone I trusted. But I got a second chance, and now, so do all of you." The women clapped softly, some teary-eyed, others smiling for the first time in weeks. Margaret sat down among them, her heart full, not of vengeance, but peace. She had built a legacy from the ashes of betrayal, and in the twilight of her life, she had found something. Far more valuable than $440 million, she had found belonging. A year later, Margaret Bell stood on a stage in front of over 300 people, donors, lawmakers, social workers, journalists, survivors. The room was warm, the lights soft, and the silence respectful as she approached the podium. Behind her, a massive screen projected a photo of Harold's Rest and the words, "One woman's fall, a nation's awakening." She had been invited to speak at a National Elder Rights Summit, now one of the most anticipated events of the year. Margaret didn't need cue cards or a speechwriter. Her story lived in her bones, carved in wrinkles and grace. When she reached the microphone, she looked out at the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, others reverent, and she simply began. "I wasn't supposed to survive," she said, her voice steady, unshaken. "I was supposed to fade quietly, like so many other older women do after they've been forgotten, used, or pushed aside. I was supposed to disappear." She paused, but I didn't. The crowd leaned in. There was something about her presence. She wasn't flashy or loud. She wasn't trying to be anyone's hero, and maybe that's what made her powerful. I raised a man who called me Mom. I gave him shelter, food, love. Everything I had left after losing my husband. And when he didn't need me anymore, he took my home and threw me out, just like that. I was 77, sitting in a women's shelter with a suitcase and a plastic bag of pills. She waited. Let it sink in. And then I scratched a lottery ticket. Dumb luck, a miracle maybe, $440 million. People ask me if that money changed my life, and I tell them no, it didn't change my life, it gave me the tools to reclaim it. Applause broke out. She didn't stop it. But this isn't a story about winning the lottery. This is a story about how we treat people once they're no longer useful to us. It's about how easy it is to discard the old, the weak, the kind. She took a slow breath. Today, I run 3 homes across the South. They're not charities. They're sanctuaries for women who've been taken for granted, silenced, or erased. Women who gave everything and were left with nothing. She looked directly at a row of lawmakers in the front row. And let me be clear, this problem isn't personal. It's systemic. It's legal. It's cultural. We teach our youth to chase success, but we don't teach them to respect those who came before. And until we do, stories like mine will keep repeating. Silence. Deep, thoughtful silence. Then one woman in the back stood up and clapped. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the whole room was on their feet, a standing ovation. Margaret stepped back, nodded once, and walked off the stage, quietly, the same way she had entered the room. That night, alone in her hotel suite, she sat by the window, tea in hand, watching the city lights below. Her reflection stared back. At her in the glass, silver hair, tired eyes, but a calm that ran deep. She thought of Harold. She thought of the house, the rain, the betrayal, and then the ticket. The lawyer, the comeback. It all felt like someone else's life now. There was a knock on the door. It was Lila again, now married, running a youth shelter of her own. "They're offering to make a documentary," she said, holding a folder, "with full creative control. You could help shape the message." Margaret smiled gently. "We'll talk in the morning." She wasn't chasing the spotlight, but if her story could prevent one woman from being thrown out like she was, then it was worth telling. She walked slowly to the small writing desk and opened her journal again. This time she wrote just one sentence. "He kicked me out thinking I was weak, but he never knew that women like me don't break, we rise." Then she closed the book and smiled.